Welcome. We all made it to the very end of World Water Week. So congratulations to everyone who's here and in the room or awake at 9 a.m. on Thursday. I am Leslie Porries. I am the coordinator from GWP for a really exciting program called Global Water Leadership for a Changing Climate. We're just about a year in, and we thought this was the perfect time to really share our experience with you. As you can see from the title here, the idea is connecting WRM with WASH for a climate resilient future. This has been a hot topic this week. A lot of us are really exploring how we actually combine these two different sectors together for better outcomes, for safer, sustainable, resilient outcomes. So I'm really excited to be walking us through this conversation today. I'm going to kick things off by actually introducing Leonard Ted. He is Deputy Head of Human Development, the Human Development Department at FCDO, who is really the sponsor and the energy and resources behind this initiative. So Leonard, please, I kick it over to you, and please speak in line for everybody listening in.
Thanks, Leslie. So Leslie asked me to say a sort of few words as a scene setter, as a opener at the top of this. You'll get a lot of detail from some of the partners. Of course, what this is well, two things. One, in the context of a lot of deep sector experience for really many decades in the principles of good resource management and long experience on water and sanitation. Some of these things emphatically are not new. We know that understanding the resource, the multiple users, the multiple interfaces with the resource and how it's sustained is really critical for any form of service delivery. And what we wanted to do with this project, as Leslie was saying, it's global water leadership in a changing climate, is to bring really a lot of sort of world-class evidence, principles around sector governance, and try to encourage conversations in country to lead to better planning, better sector engagement, and to try to strengthen elements building on these large bodies of really good sector practice that the Global Water Partnership Network has. So it's active in a number of countries. UNICEF, who you'll hear from, and GWP, there's a larger number of countries, but in Malawi, Nepal, the state of Palestine, Rwanda, and Uganda, there's in particularly those countries, there's been a lot of joint working and supporting joint planning there. It takes, so of course, all week we've been hearing about climate impacts, and some of these are statements which are made really at quite general levels, in sort of high level, without really being specific about what's meant by that. Of course, when there's really clear evidence, when the data can support new approaches to planning, planning that switches from previous linear assumptions of 1 in 1,000 year, where these things are really not continuing to be relevant in the context of some of the changes that we see, and how what sector leadership can be supported. What else to say? It's something from a donor perspective is that increasingly we find that our resources, our financial resources that we're able to help support in the sector, come from the perspective of international partnership around climate change and understanding the impacts and financial flows to support the impacts of climate change. And I can only see this trend increasing. There's a lot of pressure in the international system associated with economic shocks, commodity prices, inflation. Countries are facing lots of domestic pressures, and that leads to pressures on ODA budgets. If there is a projection of a sort of a step increase in effort, I think the medium-term picture for a vast amount more ODA isn't a realistic part of that. I think it's making the best of what we have. But we've always known in the sector that ODA aids, I work for an ODA organization, FCDO, DFID as was, isn't the solution. It's aid itself can only help, and so we need to think about new and cleverer ways that ODA resources can help. And this sort of initiative on improving leadership, having more good evidence into that is what we're trying to do here. So I hand back, and thanks. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Leonard. So with that introduction, I get to hand it over to my counterpart from UNICEF, Fiona Ward, WASH specialist, who's really helping move this along from the UNICEF side. She's going to share with us actually what this program looks like in terms of implementation, and I will be driving the slides for you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully, if you go back to the previous picture, I look very tired in that, although there's a lot more energy in this room, so it's fantastic. I recognize some familiar but also importantly, friendly faces from our discussions that we had yesterday in terms of climate resilient WASH. So it's great to be here. So I work in UNICEF's headquarters, and it was very, very clear, and I was involved in the discussions of this partnership with FCDO and Global Water Partnership from the start. But it was very, very clear that it's two things. It's a marriage of the sectors, and it's a marriage of partners. And I think that's a really clear message, because we all know that I'm from WASH. So we all know that we can't have sustainable WASH services without having sustainable water resources. And of course, the impact for sustainable water resources means that you need to have properly designed WASH systems. So they're both together. We all know it's there, but we just don't do it. I think we'll come up in the panel discussion to talk about that. So that's just to say, yes, we all know it should happen, but it just hasn't happened. So this is why we're here today. So first of all, thanks all for joining. Okay. Right, so this is the background. It's really, as we mentioned, it's collaboration between the two really important sectors, water resources and WASH communities. But importantly, it's also to jointly, and not just independently, but jointly identify the impacts of climate change, but also look at what solutions there are and how can these be implemented and how can capacity be built. And as Leonard said, it's looking at beyond financing of ODA, it's looking to see what alternative opportunities are there for the sustainable delivery of both of these resources. And it's really, we all talk about breaking down silos, but it's really just a concentrated effort to make sure that we're working on this together and we have solutions that can be implemented together. Okay, so this is part of a larger program. I'm sure you all know we have WHO, the GWP program, and sanitation and water for all. I'm not sure whether any of you were involved in the sector ministers meeting that happened in May, but certainly there was a lot of feedback at that about the importance of these two sectors working together. So this is UNICEF and the Global Water Partnership are together, but it's a part of the overall support from FCDO to these 5 organizations working on many areas together. Okay. So if you ever try to put these slides together when you have jet lag, it's not so easy because they, with all the text, so just to say, anyway. So the outputs, so just to explain what the theory of change is. So as we've mentioned, it's really about strengthening the leadership and collaboration, and it's leadership and the collaboration and its identification from different sources of data and analysis. And it's also collaboration with SWA and the JMP and WHO, who are all contributing towards this. So what can we do? What evidence is there? What solutions are there? And importantly, it's looking at the bottlenecks. So what are the bottlenecks in terms of working together and in our respective sectors? And importantly, it's focusing on, well, how do you stimulate government-led action? So it's not just about international organizations or national organizations. It's really just how can you stimulate and provide evidence, and then hopefully contribute to discussions on national budget allocations and policy discussions. So the outputs are this, and these will then contribute towards shorter and longer term outcomes. And this is the focus. And I'm not, if for some of you who are in yesterday's discussion, it's also looking at the importance of having climate resilient WASH and water resources in terms of key national policies, an example, and also like plans like national adaptation plans, or importantly commitments like nationally determined contributions. So it's looking at these, how are these recognized in these important documents, and how can they complement each other? And then there's a longer term in terms of what it will lead to in terms of safely managed water management and WASH services. So we're not just talking about water services, we're talking about water and sanitation services, and how overall this will contribute to the improved resilience, health and well-being for low income and vulnerable people. So just to focus on, this is the theory of change. The program, go to the next slide, please. The program is in 10 countries. And so as Leonard mentioned, I think there's 5 countries where we're all working, where we're both working together, but because of the nature of our programs, we also have countries where GWP is leading, but UNICEF has a presence, and then where UNICEF is leading, and we're in those countries, we're also coordinating together to highlight what we're doing and to get involvement of both partners. So just to say that the 5 countries where we are working together is Uganda, Rwanda, Malawi, State of Palestine and Nepal. And then UNICEF is working in Bangladesh, Chad, and Madagascar with coordinating with GWP. And then GWP is working in Tanzania and CAR. So this is it. So we have 10 countries in 4 regions. Ideally, of course, people will be wondering why we're not doing it in all regions. I think there's also, UNICEF also has many multi-country grants, but it's also because then they're all in different time zones. But this is just really, okay, let's really focus on this. And because you have a wide range also here of climatic concerns and different risks. So it's also interesting looking at the programming context, the scales of the programs, how far these countries are already in terms of the climate change agenda, and then looking also at the regional distribution. Thanks, Leslie. Next, yeah. So these are the 3 outputs. These are structured in the agreements for all of the agencies. We're contributing, UNICEF is contributing, focusing on number 3, and GWP is looking at number 1 and number 3. But again, is looking at the leadership in both sectors, how they can lead at a global, regional, and national level, what evidence there is, and this is really important in terms of collecting data, really looking at the impact that if we don't have sustainable water resources, what is the impact on WASH services and vice versa? And also just looking at, well, what are the bottlenecks to progress in terms of systematic and financial constraints? So it's looking at the sustainability aspects of it and what are the opportunities to really scale this up. Thanks, Leslie. Yeah. So we started in April 2021. We started and the program is going on until September 2024. So for those of you who have worked on projects with a very short time frame, you'll know that this is like a luxury. Often you get funding for, I'm sure you've all had experience of getting funding for 3 months or 6 months. And to start this process at a country level is very complex. Just, both agencies have been in country, but just changing the mindset of our own teams, getting them to work together and to integrate and to constantly think about each other when they're planning different events and deciding on priorities, but then also moving the whole sectors and getting sectors to work together. So this is really, certainly from my experience, it's a luxury to have a time frame of this that is really allows the sectors to come together and to see what needs to change, because for sure there will be some changes. Some countries will need more help in one areas and others in a different. So this is just, it's really unheard of. I haven't differentiated here between areas of focus of UNICEF and GWP because it's important that we're contributing to both, but it's really just trying to really focus on the multi-stakeholder consultation. So this is where groups will get together where both parties will be involved, and in many cases at a national level they have never even been involved in such discussions. And importantly, also promoting this integration at key international events, including the sector ministers meeting and also at COP. And then there's also focus on water resource snapshots, but also importantly, and that came up in a number of discussions yesterday on climate resilient WASH, is about the financing. It's not just a dependence upon external climate funds, but it's also about national financing and more sustainable opportunities. And then I'm sure many of you are aware of the strategic framework for WASH climate resilient development. This is being revised. It was developed jointly, I think in 2014 between UNICEF and GWP, and it was updated in 2017. We're actually updating it now, and it's really, well, it's very positive, isn't it? If you think that actually it needs to be updated so often because things are changing so quickly. So the new one also has a strong focus on climate resilient sanitation, which I think beforehand we haven't been, it didn't feature as strongly, and importantly also climate finance, but also looking at, well, how do you use climate data to be able to better design WASH, climate resilient WASH services. So we're also working on that with the World Meteorological Organization, but this is really just about, well, how do you, first of all, how do you find out where the climate data is? How do you apply that to look at your water resources and your WASH services? And then how can you build that into the climate rationale and what solutions there are? So again, yes, looking at the climate risks for both water resources and for WASH services, and looking at different solutions. We're also including some water demand management studies, and this is also a new area for us, but it's really important because of the competition, not just because of the impact of climate change, but also importantly, the increased demand for water, which we tend not to think about as much as changes in precipitation or changes in the growing patterns. But this is, I think, really, really important in terms of anticipating the changes in water demand from key sectors like agriculture as well. And also just scaling up in terms of gathering data, doing some hydrogeological assessments, finding out, well, where are the water resources? What are their characteristics? How, and then building in with the water demand changes, is this going to affect any of the services we have, but also in terms of the livelihoods and the communities which depend upon it. And I see that Thomas here, but also just talking about, well, how do we collect data more systematically on climate resilient WASH and on water scarcity? So also we're just at the very, very start of discussions in terms of working with the JMP team to see, well, what are the opportunities to develop some key indicators which can then progressively be integrated into household surveys. So this is at the very, very initial stages. There's also discussions with Bristol University in terms of how you measure climate resilience, which is very difficult. How do you measure a climate resilient water service or sanitation service, but also how do you measure a climate resilient community? Okay. Okay.
Please have a seat. Actually, you can even hold on to the microphone. So with Fiona and having understanding basically what the program is trying to do, we wanted to hear global water leadership in a changing climate perspectives on this from some of the leaders within our organizations who actually conceived of the program. So keeping Fiona up here, as we said, I would also like to invite Andy Roby from FCDO, their senior water security advisor, who really drove it from that end, and also Donnie Gaillard-Pichet, who is our senior specialist in global processes at GWP. So with that, it's really exciting to have the three of you present with us. And I have a question for you, Andy. I'm going to pick on you first. So with that, you know, again, as I stated, at FCDO, you really lead on climate. And, you know, I've been in many calls with you that are really sort of gearing up for COP and really understanding climate and how we as a water sector respond to that. However, you were one of the masterminds behind bringing this program that really united WASH and WRM. And so I'd really love for you to share with everyone a bit about sort of your perspective coming from the climate side, why this was so critical and so important that FCDO really got a lot of energy behind it, please.
Yeah, great to be here this morning. And I've got to say a small sense of pride at having instigated this program. Are you picking me up, by the way? That's good. Okay, great. And I mean, to me, the catalyst for this was actually Leonard and my visit to World Water Week in 2019, which we sat down afterwards writing a report off on the trip and really recognizing that this divide between the WASH and water resource community was still there and it needed fixing. And we looked around and we talked to Paul Deverell, who picked up this idea of the need for more leadership in this space. And I think that was one of the things, as a relative newcomer to this sector. I'm a forester and I've done years of work on forest management and governance around the world. It seemed very discoordinated, what's the word? Incoherent, that's the word. And you know, at World Water Week, we saw two communities meeting separately and not interacting really. So it's great to see people from both communities here in this room. I'd love to see more of that. It's difficult because we are tribal by nature. I think we tend to work and socialize with people that we know, that have similar alignment and so on. And I think what's bringing us together, as I think Leonard alluded to, is climate change. It's an externality that we all recognize, and it impacts us all in different ways, but ultimately we're on the same planet, we're in the same society. And so, yeah, this idea of climate change and how the water wash community responds to that, I think has helpfully pulled organizations together that weren't talking enough about this. And I think we ought to put our hands up as donors and say we're partly responsible for this, at least partly responsible for it. We in FCDO split off water and water resources, I don't know, about 20 years ago, was it, Leonard? A bit less. And why was that? Well, our politicians said to us, we need to prioritize, we need to focus. And in so doing, we split apart the water cycle into, you know, the supplier of water and the consumer of water. And I use the word cycle advisedly because, of course, it is a cycle, and water moves, as all hydrologists know, back up the river systems through evapotranspiration. So it is a true cycle. And so even to call it supplier and consumer is probably simplifying what is not a simple linear supply chain, but is in fact a holistic system, hence the systems thinking, which I think is emerging as a nice way of trying to encompass the wholeness of water. And I think what this program is also attempting to do is to encourage governments to step into space where they haven't led before, where they haven't set priorities. And you all know that UN Water's coming up, COP27 in the middle. And for the first time, I think water has an opportunity to be on the international stage for global leaders, and I mean heads of state, to say that it's important, because the global water crisis is not going to be fixed by us in this room, I'm afraid to say. It takes our politicians to set those agendas. And I wanted to say another word about how I think change happens in the water, in water. And I think this is how change has happened in my experience as a forester. And that's through multiple drivers of change. And in FCDO, we've developed a theory of change, exploring some new drivers for change in the water sector. And the ones that I think we donors have focused on spending money and trying to get policy right, but it's detached from implementation. And I'm thinking, who implements really what we do? It's the private sector. Who governs the private sector is enforcement, but also markets. And we consumers affect markets in our choices. We affect markets in how we invest. And we haven't really explored those drivers. I was yesterday at CEO Water Mandate talking to companies and saying, you know, are you stepping forward and leading in that space? What are the drivers for your businesses? We as government, and I'm speaking as government, we want to see that leadership so that we can set the bar and bring everybody up. So I'm looking for that in this new program that we're launching next week, and I'd like to invite you all to that. It's an early market engagement, which is a terrible term, which basically means we are looking for more partnership. We're looking for more innovation, and I'm happy to share the link to that. It's a virtual meeting. We will talk about a new concept note for a program that we're developing as we speak, and hoping to launch at COP27. Just one final word, though. Sorry to grab the mic and monopolize, and I'm sorry I have to shoot off fairly soon after this. The role of civil society in this is something that's been bothering me, again, as somebody coming from the forest sector and coming in and seeing a civil society in Water and WASH that's focused far too much on just getting official development assistance to do stuff on the ground and not enough on the accountability. And I know this is a theme that will resonate with many of you in the room, but we have to shift the way that we are working as civil society. And in that program I mentioned, we will be strengthening civil society's voice. We'll be looking at where there are seeds of interest and motivation at grassroots level through not just NGOs, but civil society in the broader sense, faith-based organizations, trade unions. Let's think much more broadly about who cares about water. And you then find all sorts of quite influential groups. Okay, anecdotes. I haven't got time for anecdotes. But if anybody wants to come and talk to me about this, lots of experience to share. And this is the way, bringing it back to the cycle at the beginning, how you get political leaders to back you. We have examples in the UK now where our water utilities are being bashed over the head for pollution and over abstraction, right? This is coming from the fishers, the people that fish in the river, the surfers against sewage, the ecologists, school children going out and paddling in water and coming back with nasty diseases, that sort of thing. And it's now resonating in, thank goodness, the top ends of our government. So, and then change will happen. Our utilities will be, I'm sure, reformed and regulated better. So anyway, I'm just looking forward to hearing some more about global water leadership. Very proud of where you've got to. I know Paul Deverell would love to be here too, and I'm sure he's online, hopefully, and will contribute as best he can. But yeah, you're doing great work, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this is going to roll out on the ground in the 3 case studies ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. It's really, it's inspiring to also hear, you know, implementing something, but hearing what the vision was and getting reminded of that larger vision sometimes is really refreshing and rewarding. With that, I was actually going to hand the microphone over to Donnie. And I actually have the same question for Donnie as well as Fiona. So Fiona, you're going to have more time. Donnie's on the spot. So, but you've been doing a lot of talking so far, and I wanted to sort of look at this from the, you know, it's great to hear the vision and the perspective from the donor, right? But then there is the challenge, and a lot of us in the room know the challenge of doing the work and really sort of encouraging the work, shepherding it along on the ground. And so what I wanted to hear from the 2 organizations that really, you know, have the onus of responsibility in making things happen. So what have been, you know, translating the vision, because all 3 of you were involved in the vision too, and the design. I came in much later, so I'm not as much a part of that from the concept. But how did you? What have been the challenges that you've been experiences when you translate a wonderful altruistic vision, you know, and really look at how do you combine 2 large organizations with very specific ways of working? How do you, and different objectives too? How do you really combine these on the ground? What have been some of the challenges? Donnie, I'll start with you, and then Fiona will have the chance to also give some opinions.
Thanks so much, Leslie. First of all, I just want to say that I am speaking from a slightly removed perspective, because I'm not actually on the ground, but I do see the challenges that we've had at the coordination level. Leslie's probably much more better placed to speak to the more specific challenges. She'll be actually going to countries to see, to help on site in the coming months. So I think I wanted to focus on 2 specific challenges, and that's not specific to this program. It's something that I see in lots of different programs, but the first thing is that I think that there's a tendency to want to keep doing the things that we know how to do, and the way that we have always done them. And so while there's merit in not reinventing the wheel, and there is merit in building on existing initiatives and you know, good energy that already is out there, sometimes I think it's really important to pause and to ask ourselves, how can we actually be more effective, and how can we do things differently? Because I think what we've heard often is that business as usual is not going to get us to where we need to be. So we can't just keep on running in the same direction. We have to take that opportunity to think outside of the box. And so the concept of multi-stakeholder change processes has been somewhat difficult to implement, but it's also very exciting and invigorating because you allow yourself that creativity to say, okay, well, how can we actually change things? You know, how can we get things to work together better? And then the second thing that I would maybe draw a little attention to is, and it's along the same lines, it's identifying stakeholders that we don't always have the tendency to work with, right? So how do we go beyond the usual suspects in these conversations, beyond the water stakeholders, beyond the water ministries, to local authorities, to women's organizations that are working on the ground, to youth, to indigenous representatives, to farmers? How do you get them around the table and involved in these conversations? And I think what's really important is getting this broader set of stakeholders involved is fundamentally going to change the value of the solutions that you can create, and the value of the process as a whole, and ultimately the success of the entire program, right? So overall, I think my message here is we need to dare to do things differently in both stakeholder engagement and in process design. Thank you.
Lesson 1, never go last on a panel. Lesson 2, learn how to write notes properly, because I scribble things during Andy's impassioned plea and now I can't read my handwriting. And lesson 3, I think I'm sure our country teams are shouting at the screen when they're listening to this as they connect remotely, thinking they have lots of ideas on what contributions they would make. I think from my side, I mean, obviously what Danny has said has pretty much covered what I was going to say. But I would say is what has been, I wouldn't say a challenge, but a surprise has been how different the contexts are in different countries. I mean, we know that it's different. It's just how different they are, how different the teams are, how different the programming context is, how different it is the government relationships are. So I think that has been a surprise, certainly for me. I mean, at least there is quite a lot of flexibility built in. And one thing I didn't mention is that if people have ideas on things that weren't mentioned that you think would really help, I'd be really interested in, we would be really interested in hearing that afterwards. In some respects, I think it's almost like, I would say, an arranged marriage. I mean, we have UNICEF knows each other, GWC knows each other, probably we're more familiar at the headquarters level, but at a country level, there's, you know, we also have staff move on, GWP staff work in different ways. We are two very, very different organizations at very, very different scales. So I think I perhaps underestimated also how long it takes for people to get to know each other, not just in terms of sectors, but also in terms of personalities, because that's how it all works, isn't it? You know, you have a good relationship with the person, you go around, you arrange to catch up. And I think I think that has struck me, that has taken, in some cases, it has been very, very fast and things have worked on very well. The country teams have worked on joint work plans. And I was really astonished seeing from the country teams what ideas they had, and really that they just saw opportunities for collaboration that we hadn't. So I think that for me has been a big thing in terms of how people ran very quickly, but other teams needed a bit more support. And I think it's just been I mean, on top of this, you also have the transition to trying to program climate resilience into our WASH programming. So there's a lot of things going on, but it's also just, I think there's also trying to get over, should we say, a culture of blame. I mean, as Andy mentioned, with the political context in the UK, that people are highlighting the impacts when water resources are not managed properly and utilities are not managed properly. But certainly there's the agriculture sector, the water resources sector would be looking at blaming WASH in terms of the deterioration of water quality, and perhaps now with solar, excessive abstraction. And then the WASH sector could be blaming the water resources sector and agriculture in terms of depleted aquifer levels, compounding what is happening with climate change and inefficient practices. So I think that's also, I mean, that's in people's heads. So I think it's very important to get those two things together. So yeah, no, just interested to hear some, maybe in the Q&A, what experiences you have of bringing the sectors together, what ideas you have, actually, have you thought about this? So it'd be really great. But that's why I think the flexibility and the time frame are two huge factors to make this program a success. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. And so with that, I now have sort of questions that would be open for all three of you. So whoever wants to can sort of raise their hand. And then we will open up for audience Q&A, by the way. But so when we think about this, when we think about, as you just talked about, sort of the time that it does take and the personality dependency and the different country contexts and the levels of encouragement, how do we see this getting implemented at scale? And depending on how you talk about scale, you know, greater scale than it is currently, and what kind of ideas or solutions could we come up with here? Okay.
I'm happy to start.
Yeah.
And to be honest, it is just a start, because this is not a magic bullet situation. But I do think I see, you know, widespread market failure basically as a problem that needs fixing. And because if we don't have markets, you don't have investment. Without investment, you don't have the returns that maintain the infrastructure that you've got and the money to pay for the new infrastructure that you'll be needing in this climate insecure world that we're moving into. And markets are, you know, in their purest sense, they shouldn't require intervention, but the failure occurs because we've not valued water, we've not priced it properly. I had this discussion with the Egyptian Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs yesterday, which I don't think he'd mind me sharing with you, which is in Egypt, water is regarded as a free thing. The Nile is part of your identity as an Egyptian. And the water, of course, it came from Allah, it came from God. You know, it fell on the ground. But what he was reluctant to accept was that there is then a service charge, which is collecting that water, doing stuff to it, getting it to the consumer. So although God might have provided it for nothing on the ground, there was a watershed if it's surface water, and it seeped into the groundwater, et cetera. It needs to be pumped up, and so on and so forth. And so we have to get those markets to function by valuing water and pricing it properly so that the markets can function. And from that comes flows of revenue that encourages more business. And let's face it, governments and donors are not going to be able to fix this problem. You know, we are best going to be 10% of hitting those financing targets going forward. Fixing markets sounds like an easy thing, right? You know, it's not. It's weighted with all the vested interests of agriculture, big pharmaceuticals, farmers as in agricultural producers, but also industries that are water hungry. And I think recognizing where all those are in your economy is the first step to understanding it. So the data collection and putting that in the hands of policymakers so that they can make choices based on what society is saying they should need and what the climate projections are going to be is really important. And then the fixes are actually not expensive, right? In terms of money, it's changing laws, it's building up enforcement, it's getting transparency in places where out those very differences, moving. I agree with you entirely, Fiona. Moving from blame to look, we're in this together, we've got to fix it, is a fundamental part. And I think governments need to set the tone for that in the way that they talk, but with support from big industry, because they have the weight and the political power, but also from these civil society organizations. And I like your point about disruptors. We need more disruptors sort of pointing where the problems are, you know, without fear. And there's this civil society space is shrinking globally at the moment. And if you follow Global Witness, as I do, you'll know that more and more environmental journalists are getting knocked off around the world. And governments are not facing the sort of opprobrium accordingly. So market failure is my point.
I guess I would just add, for me, the implementation question at scale depends on political mobilization. And if we remember, this is called Global Water Leadership Program, right? So I think that leadership can emerge by providing proof of concept that this approach actually works on the ground, that we can solve our problems better together, that we have successful experiences to share and demonstrate, and through the emergence of that water leadership, because there is an opportunity to share those experiences on the global level, that provides an excellent pathway for others to follow. So I think that, communicating widely about our success and serving as models for other countries is also an important way that we can scale up faster.
Great. I mean, for me, I guess it's also just if we were better at understanding, and this is obviously the whole point of this, better at understanding the linkages and the climate impact and the impact of climate change on our respective sectors and how they're interconnected. I think that would be half the battle. So you have evidence. One of the key points which we showed is really about the collection of data. It's really hard to argue your point about why you need to do a certain thing if you don't have the data and the interconnection between the sectors. I mean, honestly, if you think about the population projections, the changes in recharge rates, the changes in groundwater levels, increased demand in water, industry competition, et cetera, and then you have new technologies like solar, which basically is bypassing many of the restrictions that were in place beforehand in terms of like a break, should we say, in water demand, that these are going to impact on the water resources, the ecosystems, the communities, the livelihoods, and the WASH services. And I don't think we're fully aware of that. I think for me, that's a key point. Once you understand that, or you strive to understand that and put that into the rationale, I think that will generate the urgency that is required. And also solutions, importantly, and this is where the climate rationale comes in. And just what Andy was mentioning about the value of water. I was very lucky to work in Jordan for 4 years before I went to my current post. Has anyone here worked in Jordan or the Middle East in Jordan? I mean, just in terms of water, because it was probably the thing I was just so astonished most, having also worked in Sudan, where the value of water was intrinsic and you felt it. Every drop of water was conserved. But in Jordan, the tariff system is structured with the pricing and the block system, but there's no incentive for water conservation. It's highly political. I understand it completely, but just the value of water in such a water scarce country blew my mind. That actually water is transported almost 400 kilometers from the DC aquifer near the Saudi border up to Amman. But most people don't drink water from the tap, even though it's very high quality, but actually they use it for gardening and they use it for cleaning their cars. And it's just, and there was also a huge interest in terms of desalination at a huge cost, and Jordan has no fuel. So it was just even leakage, 40% rates of leakage. So it's just, honestly, projecting in future, how are you going to, where is this water going to come from? So, and at what cost? And then as there's, a huge, focus, and this is not in Jordan, but a huge focus elsewhere. We talked about it yesterday in our session on groundwater dependent ecosystems, but in Afghanistan and Yemen, there's been a huge scaling up in terms of solar powered water systems, because it's seen as being free. Well, certainly not free, but it's free. It's cheaper than depending on a generator, but not just in terms of being kind of freer. You don't have the restrictions like the price changes or the logistical arrangements or the interruptions to supply. So there's definitely a conservation. And certainly, having spoken to farmers in the north of Jordan, their concern about water consumption was the cost for their electricity bill as the water levels went down. And that was a trigger for trying to conserve water and use more water efficient systems. But it just really, for me, it's really gathering the evidence here. How are the two sectors connected? What is the climate risks to both? What are the opportunities to work on this together? That will really kind of trigger, this fact that we can't work in silos anymore. We have to come together, but also working with the agricultural sector and other sectors. So I think the potential is enormous.
Great. I'm going to take the microphone back for a second. Stealing it. Now I have two. I actually wanted to there's one more question, but I wanted to hold the question to allow the audience to actually ask any questions that are pertinent in their mind. Might be the same question that we were going to ask. I will say we're going to conclude this panel shortly and then move on to a couple of case studies, including some remote guests who are speaking from actually implementing the work. So just to give you a heads up, I didn't actually tell you what was happening later. So, but there is a question. Okay, one and then.
Conservation International. We've had a very small but long-running program that we call WASH in watersheds that I think, you know, recognizing bottom up that we need to do a better job integrating this. So we'd be happy to share lessons from that, primarily from South Africa. But my question is whether you've already connected with the Dutch effort, which had informally been called Watershed, but is supported by the Dutch government. IRC, I believe, is the lead implementer, but also Wetlands International and the Jane Goodall Institute. I am not, you know, up to speed on what they've done in the past few years, but again, that has been running for at least 5 in its initial stage. 5 years.
Monica.
Monica Altamirano from Water Equity. I have a question, and maybe I will take courage, as Daniel asked us, to be a little bit disruptive. But I mean, I think this is great, WASH and WRM together, but I think you're missing 2 big things to make it really happen, and especially to get also private sector investment at scale. And so is the climate community, and I've read many blogs, and we think they just should get to us, but actually it's a maybe bigger community than ours. So it's really how to go with them on equal basis, but also the infrastructure finance community. And in UK particularly, I think they seem very eager to start to see infrastructure as a way for nature and people to flourish, and water, of course, will be central. So how are you planning to get them? And the last bit also, I was just also thinking, how much is needed to change the narrative? Because the people who get this water, they're actually willing to pay. And if you spoke about farmers, I'm thinking if we would focus on level of service, then they would be willing to pay. And how much are you going to focus on that in this initiative?
Thanks. And one question. Okay, so let me just, we've got a lot of questions. Okay. I'll take this one and then we'll give a chance to answer. We'll do one more round of questions and then we'll move on. But please.
Thank you. I'm Robin Tompkins. I'm from JG Africa and the senior WASH advisor to the USAID Resilient Waters program operating in Southern Africa. So we are a transboundary basin program with a WASH component, which is a bit of a square peg in a round hole because the WASH is of course a national mandate, and the basin is managed by the basin management organizations, which are a collection of representation from the riparian states. So we have been implementing a WASH sanitation project actually in the Polokwane local municipality, and working with the national governments using GLASS, the WHO's GLASS survey. What we're finding is there's nothing there. There's no mechanism or communications to send data from city level government through the structures at national government that they report to the international government structures representation in the national government to the RBMOs. So if data is so central to this, and then when you get to the RBMO, the data sharing protocol is the most contentious issue. So now if you want to include something like citywide inclusive sanitation data at the basin level, you're going to have a lot of fights between commissioners. And we really battled even in the USAID Resilient Waters program, we really battled to implement a WASH component that was speaking to the other components, which were working with the basin level stake, and also funding for basin level initiatives stops at water resources. It stops there. And the basin level organizations do not have the capacity to think about mobilizing financing into WASH initiatives at a national level, even though basin management organizations have as their one of their key priorities resilience in basin communities and safe access to water supply and sanitation. So my question is, how is your program thinking about establishing those communication mechanisms and data flow from city level government through national to the RBMOs? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Fred Kyoko from National Bank of Kenya. We have a WASH financing program that's entering its second year wholly. And just listening to the panel and just picking up from Andy, some of the comments you've made, what I'm reflecting upon is that even though we're trying to finance, water utilities, and we end up having to get involved in stewardship and water leadership ultimately. Otherwise, we'll have no water to finance. And yet, on the inverse, you've got now the integration between these two very core pillars around resource management and WASH, water resource management, WASH. And I hear now, you have to pull in the climate world as well. It's almost like you can't leave anybody out with water, and then that becomes a problem. But perhaps maybe there are some catalysts that could spur momentum. For example, just picking up on forestry. Maybe that's one of the areas that could be bite-sized and catalyze, rather than getting the whole world of climate to come in, because there you can do a riparian land protection, you can do a forest cover, and therefore ultimately influence, availability of water, its management, and therefore all of us being able to enable it. So maybe just some thoughts on maybe one or two areas, in my view, like forestry, and one or two others that we could all participate in championing, and therefore spurring more integration of other segments that can actually elevate resource management and the WASH agenda.
Thanks. And I actually realized there's a bunch of questions there, and we have people to answer. So I think we want to, where would we like to start? So just to summarize, we had the CI program, we had the provocative sort of what might be needs to continue to be included and brought in. Oh, Donnie, you want to go?
Because we do not go into countries and tell them what to do.
Yeah,
that is absolutely the opposite of what we're doing. We're facilitating a process so that these stakeholders can talk together, can identify what the biggest bottlenecks are, can prioritize those, because they can't do everything at the same time, right? So they can say, okay, well, we have 10 problems here, but we're going to focus on these 3, and then assemble communities that can work together over the course of a year. And like Fiona said, we have the luxury of having a lot of time to put this process in place, so that they can come up with strategies for overcoming those bottlenecks, and also identifying the resources available that might help finance those strategies, right? So that's just to say, it's not like we're going to dictate in any sense. It's the stakeholders that will determine what their priorities are. So then maybe I can share with you.
Yeah. Thanks for that tip on that project. We'll definitely look that one up. Monica, it's a great question. I think one of the ways to get infrastructure engaged in this is through the climate change community, who they are thinking a lot about infrastructure. And I just wanted to mention the water tracker, which this tool that AGWA have developed, drawing on climate data and this existential experience that we're all facing ahead. And helping basically governments, and I know it's something that this program is engaging with, governments work out where they should focus their attention. Is it forests? Is it infrastructure? Is it desertification? Where is the risk greatest? What does that mean for your economy? What does that mean for your future as a government? If you're in a democracy, and even if you're not in a democracy, the citizens still do care, and you have to keep them watered, as they say. And I think that's a good place for those discussions to start. And I think we're finding that that's very simple decision making. Yes, no, have we thought about this question in the tracker, is stimulating countries to reflect on those, reach across sectors, but also look down at, if you like, down through the structures to regional policies and municipalities, and drawing those communities together. At the end of the day, we've got adaptation plans that are supposed to be reported at the subsequent COPs. These are the times when governments are held accountable for their adaptation work. And if you thought about this, as I do a lot, we have mitigation as a global issue. we have to work together as a planet on mitigation. Adaptation is slightly different in that these are essentially sovereign issues. There are transboundary boundary issues. Countries have to step into this space and do it for their own good. Otherwise, they won't be ready for the change. And I think another principle that I wanted to share with you, which John Matthews and Ingrid and others will give you chapter and verse on, is this concept of deep uncertainty. We are really stepping into a period of unknown, where infrastructure, bigger, fatter, stronger, whatever it is not going to be the answer. You know, we are dealing with a situation where uncertainty means you have to have flexibility in your response. And that flexibility is best probably done through nature and nature-based solutions. I have to say that for my minister, Zach Goldsmith, but I actually fervently believe it myself.
First of all, thanks for the excellent questions. I've really enjoyed them, although perhaps we should have restructured it and had the videos before the questions. Anyway, so first of all, the question, Derek, just to say that UNICEF actually has a multi-country agreement with the Dutch government. We also have a partnership with IRC, so thanks for that. I hadn't heard about it, but definitely we will be following up. Monica, your question is excellent. What we didn't talk about, because we did a discussion on it yesterday in terms of basically the wake-up call, and I think you'll probably hear about it in the Rwanda presentation, but it was really, I mean, certainly in WASH, nobody knew who the national designated authority was. And often they're the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Environment, and we work with our own line ministries. And in, you know, thinking about it clinically, it was like, yeah, why on earth do we not talk to the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Finance? And then you find out all these really key important discussions are going on, and A, we had no idea they were going on, B, that they're going on currently in like somewhere 2 kilometers away from the ministry, our line ministry's office. But actually, and then, and actually we had the session yesterday on climate resilient WASH, just because there's some videos, like we have the example from Chad also, where, you know, it wasn't too late. And even though the NDC process was going on last year, we're actually, even within the short period of a year, we could actually highlight who was doing what important discussions were going on, how these could be influenced, what we needed to bring to the table, how to waken up the whole of the WASH and WRM sectors as these discussions are going on. And actually, currently, our services, the risks to climate are not reflected in these at all. So we've actually already, even in a short period of time, had an impact on that in terms of influencing the NAPs and the NDCs. So if you have time, that'd be great if you could look at that. In terms of the willingness to pay, absolutely. I mean, there's a very small infrastructure component of this project. It's mainly just highlighting what works, but absolutely. I mean, it's really looking at ensuring. So part of this is also developing technical papers on sustainable yield assessments incorporating future water demand, as well as this whole thing about monitoring. But also just, okay, well, what are the options? What are the water demand management solutions? So it's also looking at, you know, what are the implications of changing a service? How sustainable is that? And then looking at, you know, whether people will pay, and then what the impact and how you can, the WASH community, water resources can work together. But absolutely, it is all about making sustainable services. So there are some research parts of this, but it's not the major part. It really depends on the country context, but absolutely that is the direction we're going in. But it's mainly just to understand what are the impacts. Loads of questions. In terms of you're absolutely right in terms of the data, but I mean, there's lots of other agencies in it. What we are trying to do is really highlight where the gaps are. So if the information isn't available, or it's available but it's not being shared at different levels, I think certainly with the risk analysis that would flag what data is missing. But this is why I think the JMP integrating some of these questions more so at the household level is really just trying to highlight the impact. But I think it's connected to the larger data analysis, looking at, well, what certainly when we looked at groundwater monitoring, it was also just actually there may be one logger, but actually either the data isn't being collected, or it's not being analyzed, or it's not being shared. So I think it's definitely making progress towards that, to flag where things need to be improved, but there's a long way to go in that. But I absolutely hear you. And Fred, it's fantastic to hear that someone from the National Bank of Kenya is here. I mean, it's just,
Yes.
I hope it's somewhat, no, honestly, but it's fantastic. And also just to say, I had like loads of scribbles and now I can't read. But just to say that UNICEF and GWP are actually working with UNDP on a proposal for climate resilient water resources and WASH services in Togo. I mean, it's taken some time, but it's also just building up the investment case and what is viable. So then it's the prioritization of which areas were the most vulnerable, which sectors, which aspects of the sectors were the most vulnerable to concentrate on, and what would the impact be. But going back to the question on and also on the linkage to the private sector, it's also just highlighting the opportunities for the private sector so that there's everyone has an interest in it. And then you're building towards it, but it is a long process. But I think it's changing very quickly. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks. So wow, okay, this is great. We weren't even sure if that many people would be in the room on the last day, and then everyone's here and has questions, and we could keep going. But I do want to keep us moving on. We actually, as I said, have two colleagues on the line who want to share their stories. I am realizing, though, that before I invite them to share their stories, I do want to actually give a teeny bit more framing context to some of the main activities that have been happening to date that give color to what they're about to share. And Donnie was referring to this. One of the main sort of kickoff points for this program at the country level has been these multi-stakeholder consultations. All of these happened actually within the past like 2 months. And the teams came together and then also recruited from across their communities, and we pushed them to be as inclusive and go outside their comfort zone as possible in terms of bringing more and more people into the room. They had these large multi-stakeholder consultations. As a group, they identified their top 3 or 4 barriers to climate smart water management. They did it. We did not control what those outcomes are. They were reporting back to me later what they decided. I wasn't in the room. I wasn't listening in. It was very group led. From those consultations for each barrier, they are now formalizing working groups. Now, these working groups are time bound and will only be meeting for the next year. And their specific goal is only to address this key barrier, and it's to come up with a response strategy that is part 1, an action plan. And also part 2, a finance plan. We have made it super clear that FCDO is not going to fly in and finance whatever they come up with. Right. And so we are also working to make sure they have the right kind of assistance on the ground to get the capacity building that they need to understand more and better. How do you actually develop a finance plan? Because we all know that we're a bunch of water people and finance is not necessarily our strength, and nor can we expect it to be so in the country. And this is the kind of, and these finance plans might not be perfect at the end of a year, but it represents an important step in sort of really ensuring that greater knowledge is there and stays there, and creates within the group. And then the other side, and actually when we hear from Deborah, she's going to talk about that multi-stakeholder process in a way that I think I'm personally really, really excited about in Malawi. And then one of the other things that was also alluded to when Fiona was giving the introduction is there is a lot of coordination with SWA and political leadership and political mobilization, right? And so, and again, because these two sectors haven't really integrated necessarily a whole lot in country, we made a lot of efforts to make sure that the WRM community participated in the preparations for the sector ministers meeting that happened back in May. In some cases, this was the first time that these communities were actually coming together and talk. And this is not like us planning to do something together. This is how do we prepare our minister to give the right kind of remarks and say the right kind of things, or understand how to engage in certain types of conversations in an environment where he or she might not be comfortable. And so Hillary from Uganda is going to talk about sort of that experience of really coming together with his WASH community and for a shared goal. And then also what we'll also be hearing, and Fiona was talking about this, we'll hear from the UNICEF side about how, again, that shared goal really from the specific organizational sides of UNICEF and GWP came together to think about and develop a joint strategy, right? Because sometimes that can be scary. It's like, okay, we want you to just sit in a room and come up with a strategy. How are you going to work together, right? Like, I mean, That's hard. That's hard for any of us. You sit down at a table with somebody and you're like, what do we do? I don't know. I don't know. So, I mean, and these are real life problems for us. And so we're going to hear from some of the voices in the field. And now I am going to turn it over to Hillary. Or I'm sorry, I'm actually turning it over to Deborah first. My apologies. Okay, thank you, Angie. Deborah, are you on the line?
Yes, Leslie.
Great, we're so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much, and greetings, everyone.
Hi, we're all saying hi.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about multi-stakeholder consultation that happened in Malawi. So this was part of the global water leadership deliverables. And this was done in consultation with the Ministry of Sanitation and Water. Next slide, please. So in terms of our definition, in coming up with the voices, we needed to look at the voices that will give us meaningful but also broad participation. So first of all, we defined that we needed to get as many voices as we could. These voices included line ministries of agriculture, environment, finance, forestry, gender, and all related ministries. We also had voices from the donor community. UNICEF was part of the process. We also had voices from CSOs in that regard. And basically what we wanted to do was to have as many voices so that we have rich data, but also results that will be accepted by each and every person in the country. And then we also went out to get the voices. Instead of waiting for the stakeholders to come to us, we went out basically in the regions all over the country. Our idea was that we find them at their home ground, so we are able to relate what is being said and what is on the ground, but also where we are saying that different areas have different challenges, we needed to get those challenges from where they are. And also we defined in terms of the marginalized, these are people that are voiceless. So looking at the community groupings that we visited, there were internally displaced people that were displaced due to the floods that happened earlier this year. And that picture there is showing their homes of these people that are internally displaced. These were visited, but there are also farmers in that regard. And we also visited the Water User Association. These are community groups that are in charge of rural water supply. But we also managed to visit farmers that are doing irrigation farming so that we are able to collect those voices. We also had voices from the district government. So these are the line staff that interact with the communities. Their voices are important in that regard, but also the local CSOs with no financial capacity to make it to national level meetings. So these voiceless, in our understanding, is that these are basically the voices that in a national meeting, their voices will be overshadowed, but also where given equal opportunities, they will not make it to national stakeholder consultation. So these are the voices that we reached out in terms of stakeholder consultation. Next slide, please. So during the consultation, we framed it in a way that it was in two phases. So the first phase, we looked at the, we went to the regional places, so the regional level consultation, where we had these regional government staff. We also had district government staff. We also had local CSOs, but also the community groups that I mentioned about. And in this regional consultation, our focus was on group discussion. where groups were defined based on the so many expertise that were in the room. So not necessarily grouping them according to expertise, but mix them so that the ideas come out in that regard. But also for the community groups, we had the focus group discussions where those committees were put in one place and being able to bring out their issues in that regard. But also during the national consultation, we also had a gender analysis framework where participants were given before the consultation to fill in the form. And during the consultation, the group was able to move along, agree or disagree on what was coming out. Then after the regional consultation, then we went for the national consultation. At this national consultation, then we had the national government in that regard. Then we had the academia, international NGOs, government parastatals. We also had media in this regard, but also the donor community. So during the national consultation, what happened was that a presentation was made from the regional, what was collected from the regional consultation. And that is the presentation that the national stakeholders discussed over it, discussing the results and agreeing and disagreeing in that regard. At the end of the day, voting was done for the top 3 barriers that came out in that meeting. So it was a discussion and then voting in that regard. Next slide, please. So what we are seeing at the larger picture is that what was taken or what was gotten from the stakeholder consultation and they are about developing our strategy is based on genuine voices. All the voices that needed to be represented were represented. And the strategies that will be developed at a larger picture then aligns with the broader Pan-African programs and initiatives. In our context, we have the Continental African Water Investment Program that was adopted by the African head of states, those that sit under African Union in 2021. And through that, basically the objective is to make sure that there is climate resilient development through inclusive gender investment towards water security and also towards sanitation services. So we are seeing the fit in that program in that regard. And also through the same African investment program, there is a scorecard that has been developed that will be able to track progress towards investment in the water sector. So this is exciting to us as we feed into the Pan-African programs as a country, but also beyond that, then we know that we are on track. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deborah. And we're going to bring you back in a little while for some Q&A for you. But as we move on, we're now, Murtaza Malik is going to be sharing with us through a video about the experience that has happened in Rwanda of the joint development of the plan. Technical.
Hello, everyone from Kigali. My name is Murtaza Malik. I'm the Chief of WASH with UNICEF in Rwanda. It's my great pleasure to be with you here today to talk about our work in Rwanda and to share with you what the impact has been. The water resources of Rwanda are changing, and traditional sources, including springs and surface water, are being threatened due to lowering levels and yield and increasing demand. The GWL program is very timely. We started on our journey together in mid last year, and it has been a very interesting and positive experience, making us think in different ways and about different partnerships. Some of the key activities which have been identified by both Global Water Partnership and UNICEF for implementation under the GWL include the development of a snapshot on water resources, the facilitation of key stakeholders to identify bottlenecks to climate resilient water resources and water services, building capacity on climate financing and the identification of opportunities to leverage these for both sectors, and strengthening and understanding of the hydrogeology of Rwanda and how this is and will be impacted by further climate change. This includes the installation of remote data loggers and supporting the establishment of an early warning system. What are the opportunities that this collaboration has presented to Rwanda? Importantly, the process to develop a work plan facilitated the identification and prioritization of key activities which are being implemented together. This collaboration and expansion to support hydrogeology and water monitoring has brought new partners to the sector, including collaboration with the Ministry of Agriculture. It has also highlighted the importance of water resources, which are climate resilient. This represents a change in focus to address the challenges of climate change and increase water demands. We are looking forward to the next phase of the program, which will allow the expansion of critical activities to be implemented in country. And we look forward to sharing our progress with you next year. Thank you very much for your time, and handing back to Leslie.
Very well coordinated. Oh, that is not on. Where did I? Okay, there we go. Okay, there we go. All right. So now we are actually going to, all right, yes. Now we're actually going to turn things over to Hillary, who will be online calling from Uganda. Hillary.
Oh, thank you very much, Leslie. Good morning, colleagues. It's a pleasure to have this presentation in the World Water Week, and I'm going to present a message that was contributed by GWP Uganda towards the Sector Ministers meeting that happened in May, and that was in response to WASH and climate change. If I can share my screen, Leslie, you're going to share or share?
I've got it for you. Just tell me when to go.
Oh, please. Okay, please.
Can you bring up the?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm giving you the brief overview for the sector meeting. And what we are looking at here in supporting Uganda, briefly to give a key message for the Minister of Water and Environment, who is Honorable Beatrice Anywa. We were looking at how can IWRM and WASH work together. And so here we looked at the stakeholders who are supposed to be engaged. And in this way, we look at what level are these stakeholders supposed to be engaged in. So we're looking at a way of bringing stakeholders from national level to involve them in engaging stakeholders in WASH sector as well as those outside WASH, so that stakeholders can be able to know what is the relationship between WASH and IWRM. So these ones can be achieved in some of the events like Uganda Water Week. So the stakeholders, that is the perspective on how they can get to understand IWRM and WASH. And also looking at climate and WASH policy analysis, showing the relevance why WASH and IWRM priorities is supposed to be highlighted in NDCs and NAPs. Building human capacity building in early warning systems, innovations, water catchment management, and all those. And of course, looking at climate risk to WASH and IWRM, these are drought challenges, flooding, landslides, among others, including degradation, pollution, and all those. Then we're also looking at potential climate resilient WASH solutions. So here we are looking at water and sanitation hygiene, specifically on how can these ones support each other. Then also another overview was on financing for climate resilient WASH responses, which was looking specifically at mobilizing for IWRM and WASH, that is in financial mobilization. So these are the key areas where we supported Uganda to give a message, a brief overview. Next. Yes, thank you very much. Can you go to the next page? Yes, thank you. So the reforms here, Uganda presented under Dialogue 2 that it was sustainable recovery through reforms and collective actions. And the reforms here, we are looking at what Uganda did during the COVID-19 time. So these were high-level political leadership where engagements were being put on table from ministers, political leaders, and all those to support the country in recovering from COVID-19, bringing decisions on how to increase the budget, promoting standard operating procedures, the multi-sectoral approach to finance, as in bringing supporting indigenous knowledge, like we have people who developed in medicine here in Uganda that was trying to reduce on the COVID-19 spread, improving people's immunity. So those were the kind of sectoral approach to finance by government giving support to people. And also ensuring reliable, updated, and effective communication among stakeholders in the country at all levels, where key messages were developed and disseminated at all levels. But of course, here we had a president becoming a champion of WASH, where he was demonstrating how to use water effectively and how to dispose of these masks that we are using so that they can be environmental friendly. People can become environmental friendly in responding to COVID-19. But also, how did how did the government achieve this? So it was through different governance mechanisms where there was establishment of strengthened local government council and parliamentary on IWRM and WASH platforms, developing ministerial technical working groups to discuss relationships between IWRM and WASH sector in managing climate change during the pandemic, preparing high-level benchmarking and exchange visits on IWRM and WASH from those successful institutions or countries outside, because we could see some ministers moving from out of the country to benchmark and how they were managing. And of course, enlisting the support of the head of the state to ensure increased financing towards IWRM WASH sector, and of course, establish and maintaining clear risk communication protocols. Next page. So Uganda, during the sector ministers meeting, developed or suggested new commitments, or is trying to commit itself to achieve by 2023-2024. One of the commitments is that it's going to develop a climate financing WASH and IWRM investment plan by 2023, and develop a NAP for WASH sector by 2024. And of course, increasing or building capacity of stakeholders to understand and mainstream the WASH and climate change nexus by 2024. And of course, improving water efficiency through promoting and encouraging water harvesting and efficient water utilization among household institutions and sectors. So here in the picture, you see that is the Minister of Water and Environment presenting in the sector ministers meeting. Yeah, that is my presentation from the key message we developed to give the Minister for Uganda and the sector ministers meeting. Thank you very much.
So actually, at this point, could we bring the two of them up on their faces? So we're gonna share the screen, and we don't have as much time for Q&A as I wanted, because we've run a little we've run a little behind time, which is okay because we've had really good conversation, but please, yes, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Please go. We're going to turn on the cameras. Please turn on the cameras. Sorry, Hillary, Deborah. Yay, we have you. So I have one question for each of you, and if there's a chance, I'll open it up to the audience, but then we do have to move into closing remarks because we're close on time. But Deborah, I'm going to start with you since you spoke first. And you highlighted that there was this need, and I thought quite innovative, going out to the regions to collect the impressions and really get the voices of the voiceless and be able to bring those back to the national level conversation. What I was curious about was there really actually a difference between what the opinions about the barriers to WASH that you heard when you went to the regions versus what the national level actors thought of as the real barriers? And could you share with us a little bit about how those two opinions were sort of shared and the barriers decided on, briefly?
Okay, thank you, Leslie. So, yeah, in terms of what came out of the regional meetings, bringing to the national stakeholders, there was a heated debate on some of the barriers that came out, which at national level, stakeholders were not in agreement. There was that heated debate, but at the end of the day, it was agreed that what came out of the regional meetings were actually what the challenges were in the country, but based on a very heated debate. Thanks.
It feels like that's information for more stories and private conversations later, maybe. But thank you for that. When I turn, Hillary, I want to come back to you again. And you highlighted a lot about the process that happened for preparing for the SMM. But my understanding was that before the sector ministers meeting and these preparation, there wasn't a whole lot of interaction between the WASH sector and the WRM sector. And do you think there is more now than there was? Because, and why? What do you think has happened or what has changed?
Yeah, thank you very much, Leslie. For me, I believe before the SMM meeting, there was maybe lack of understanding that there is really a great connection between IWRM and WASH. And for us, when we were presenting this message for the minister, we tried to look at the relationship, and we discussed. We went in through a preparatory meeting where we had the IRC WASH, and of course, you said Uganda Water and Sanitation Network, Ministry of Water and Environment, GWP were also presented, and UNICEF. So these collective ideas tried to help us understand how can we really support IWRM and WASH. Of course, WASH cannot be there when we don't have IWRM, the integrated water resource management. So these must be supporting each other. So I believe that right now, from what was presented in the SMM meeting, there is really a great understanding that these two are working together, and there is a good way to put a strategy on how we can achieve and come out of and try to become more climate resilient. Thank you.
Great. And I would, if we have one or two questions from the audience for Hillary or Deborah, I would love to ask. Does anyone have one? Okay, I guess we don't have any questions. I think people are sort of processing the different stories and details that you've shared with us. So thank you so much for sharing, and I look forward to watching how all of these things develop and we get to follow these over the course of the program. So I guess back to the slides, please. All right. And so with that, I guess this actually does bring us right about to, this brings us right about to time. And with that, I would like to close us for the session. I actually want to invite GWP's Executive Secretary, Dario Soto Abril, to join us on the floor and share some of his perspectives about leadership and how this is really coming to play for UNICEF and WRM, UNICEF and GWP. So speak into the microphone so they can hear you online.
Sure. Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation. And so weird to see a picture there. Uncomfortable. Well, thank you very much again for the invitation. And yes, I wanted to share some perspective. I wanted to start with when we started conceiving this program and thinking about it even before Leslie honored us with her joining us as the manager and as the lead. One of the things that we always thought is how can we bring and bridge that apparent divide between WASH and WRM, and how can it be? And for me, who, by the way, my prior jobs have not been in the water sector, so for me was like, how can we have a divide between WASH and WRM? Aren't we talking about similar things, trying to achieve the same, trying to change the world, the same thing through water? But there's a divide, and we took this, I think, in a way that both naively, but also with a very constructive spirit of, okay, let's try to do as best as we can to bring together collaboration between the two sectors and between two big organizations like UNICEF and GWP. And we were lucky, and I'm looking at Dani because she's one of the idealists behind this project, and she was like the mother of the project. And we were lucky to not only have people like Dani, but who believe in this idea, but also a donor like FCDO who said, yes, I'm willing to invest in this and put an effort, and I think this is something worthy of trying. So that's the spirit behind the project. That's something that I learned. And I also learned that how possible, and at the same time, consuming reflection, consuming this effort is. We were lucky to engage with a wonderful partner like UNICEF, and we met with UNICEF at the highest level, and they're all like, yes, let's do it, and we can coordinate it. Definitely we need to work together, and we should make it happen. And along the way, we realized, yes, it's good, and there's the support and the intention, and we need to do more to the two organizations to bring together and carry together the people in the ground in the different countries. Because the day-to-day in the regions for organizations like GWP and UNICEF is very different than what we experience in headquarters. We have different priorities. We see the realities. There's something immediate. There's an urgency. So we learned that we had to work also to convince our own teams in the ground, and UNICEF as well. How can we make sure that people in Lebanon or in other countries are really in Nepal, that they really feel like this is a priority for them, given the realities of the countries. Countries have their own realities beyond the global one. So to me, one of the beauties of the projects and the learnings of the project has been that, yes, bridging WASH and IWRM is possible. Yes, that bridge could go and should go beyond, the top of the heads of the organizations, and should actually be something that adds value to what's happening in the countries. And also the other learning is change takes time and takes effort, and you need to be relentless, and you need to push for it and push and push and push. And people will tell you it's impossible, and then you go, no, it's possible, let's do it. And then you get people like, you see how they turn and they say, hey, it is possible. And you see people now in the countries working together, some in some elements, in other countries in another, but they're finding a way to cooperate. And this is my final thing. If you see, if you have heard Henk, the Dutch water envoy, and if you see his vision for what would be an ideal outcome of the UN Water Conference, he has a very clear vision. He said it in the park: cooperation, partnership. It cannot be that we have a sector where we have millions of organizations and entities, and we don't talk to each other, or we talk just to showcase what we do, but we don't hear what the other is really doing, and we're not willing to. Maybe we are, but we should be able to engage more. So I want to leave you this project is an experience, and it's an example of how can you really, if you dream about it and you put the effort on it, and you go at all levels and you don't relent, you can create that bridge, and you can create that spirit of partners. And I hope that taking Henk's idea that we could have more of this for the UN Water Conference, and that this program could be a good start of more collaboration between WASH and IWRM. So thank you very much for this time, and keep up the good work.
Thank you all. Thank you, Dario. I can't really add to that. I think that was a beautiful way to close it. Just as we are only 1 year in, So there's going to be a lot more, and there are more opportunities. Talk to us, share with us your ideas, and hopefully we'll have more and different to share with you, because this is a learning experience. But we also do think that the leadership we're excited to be sort of leading in some of this collaborative experience, but we want more and more people to sort of take the lead within their respective countries. And it's not about us, it's about WASH and WRM really coming together. So thank you.